There are battles that don't make headlines. Wars fought in silence, in recording studios, in the back rooms of record label offices, in the quiet moments when a man decides who he's going to be versus who the world demands he become. This is the story of one of those wars. A decades-long fight between an artist and the forces trying to own him. Between a man named Neil Young and everyone who thought they knew what Neil Young was supposed to be. November 18th, 1972. A rehearsal space somewhere in California. The air's thick with tension. Neil Young is preparing for a major tour. The Time Fades Away tour. Big venues, big expectations, big money. And standing in front of him is Danny Whitten, guitarist for Crazy Horse, a man Neil has played with for years. A friend, a collaborator, someone who helped create the sound that made Neil Young famous. But Danny Whitten is in bad shape. Really bad. He can't remember the songs, can't hold it together. The drugs have taken too much. And Neil Young, standing there watching someone he cares about fall apart, has to make a decision. Does he keep Danny on the tour and hope he pulls through? Or does he make the hard call that protects the band, the tour, the business? Neil makes the call. He gives Danny $50 and a plane ticket back to Los Angeles. Tells him to go home, get clean, come back when he's ready. That night, Danny Whitten dies. Overdose. The coroner calls, and Neil Young spends the rest of his life carrying the weight of that decision. Not because he was wrong, but because doing the right thing for the tour meant someone he cared about went home and didn't survive the night. That moment changes everything, not just for Neil, but for how he approaches fame, success, and the entire machinery of the music business. Because from that point forward, Neil Young starts fighting an invisible war. A war against being captured, against being controlled, against becoming the product that everyone wants him to be. Let me take you back further. To understand the war, you have to understand what came before it. Early 1970s. Neil Young is at the top of the music world. After years of grinding through folk clubs in Buffalo, Springfield, and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, he breaks through as a solo artist. The album Harvest becomes massive. #1 on the Billboard chart. Hits like Heart of Gold and Old Man, playing on every radio station in America. Neil Young isn't just successful, he's a superstar. And that's exactly when he starts pulling away. Most artists spend their whole lives chasing that kind of success. Neil reaches it and immediately distrusts it. Because with mass fame comes mass expectation. Bigger tours, bigger production, pressure to repeat the sound that made him successful, to give the audience more of what they want, to become a reliable product. And Neil Young hates that idea more than anything. He didn't get into music to be reliable. He got into it to be free, to follow the sound in his head wherever it leads, to make the music he needs to make, not the music the market demands. So when Harvest makes him famous, his instinct isn't to capitalize on it. His instinct is to run. That retreat becomes the pattern of his entire life. Success arrives. He walks away from it. The industry tries to define him. He redefines himself. The audience wants more of the same. He gives them something completely different, over and over, for decades. But that pattern has a cost. And in 1972, that cost starts becoming brutally clear. Danny Whitten dies on November 18th, 1972. And the guilt Neil feels doesn't just sit there quietly. It becomes fuel. Fuel for anger. Fuel for grief. Fuel for a kind of music that refuses to be polished or commercial or safe. 6 months later, another death. Bruce Berry, a roadie who worked closely with Neil in his circle. June 4th, 1973. Another overdose. Another person gone. Another reminder that the life they're all living comes with consequences that don't show up in album sales or concert reviews. And Neil Young's response isn't to process his grief privately. It's to turn it into an album. But not a tribute album, not a polished, marketable memorial. Something raw, something painful, something that sounds exactly like what it is. Awake You Can Hear, August 1973. Studio Instrument Rentals in Hollywood, SIR. A rehearsal and recording space. Neil gathers a small group. David Briggs on production, Ben Keith on pedal steel, Nils Lofgren on guitar, Billy Talbot on bass, Ralph Molina on drums, and they record an album called Tonight's the Night. The sessions are late night, loose, ragged. Nobody's trying to make it sound perfect. They're trying to make it sound true. The songs are about death, about loss, about the cost of the life they're living. And the whole thing feels like a last call at a bar where everyone's too drunk to lie anymore. When it's finished, the album sits for 2 years because nobody knows what to do with it. It's too dark, too rough, too honest. The label doesn't want to release it. They want another Harvest, another hit, another safe, marketable Neil Young album. But Neil refuses. And in June 1975, Tonight's the Night finally comes out. It doesn't sell like Harvest. It doesn't produce hit singles. But it does something more important. It draws a line in the sand. This is who Neil Young is going to be. Not the folk pop star. Not the radio-friendly troubadour. The artist who makes the music he needs to make, whether the world wants it or not. That decision costs him. Commercially, critically. People who loved Harvest are confused. Some are angry. They wanted more Heart of Gold. Instead, they got a funeral. And Neil Young accepts that cost. Because for him, freedom is more important than approval. That pattern continues through the rest of the 1970s and into the 1980s. Every time the industry thinks they've figured out what Neil Young is, he changes. Folk, rock, country, electronic, rockabilly, grunge before grunge exists. He won't stay in one place long enough for the market to capture him. And then, in 1983, the industry strikes back. Geffen Records, David Geffen's label. Neil signed with them in the early 80s. Big contract, big expectations. And the first albums he delivers are Trans and Everybody's Rockin'. Trans is a heavy electronic album with vocoders and synthesizers. Everybody's Rockin' is a throwback rockabilly record. Neither one sounds anything like what Geffen expected. And on December 1st, 1983, Geffen Records does something almost unheard of in music history. They sue Neil Young, not for breach of contract, not for missing deadlines. They sue him for making albums that are, in their words, uncharacteristic and unrepresentative. Read that again. A record label suing an artist for not sounding like himself, for refusing to deliver the product they paid for insisting on creative freedom even when it costs the label money. Neil Young later describes it simply. He was sued for not sounding like Neil Young, as if Neil Young is a fixed thing, a brand, a product with defined characteristics that must be maintained for market purposes. And that's the invisible war laid bare. The industry doesn't just want your music. They want ownership of your identity. They want to define what you are and lock you into that definition forever. Because predictability sells. Consistency sells. A reliable product sells. But Neil Young refuses to be a product. And the cost of that refusal is a lawsuit, legal fees, public criticism, people calling him difficult, self-indulgent, past his prime. All because he won't give the market what it wants. The lawsuit eventually gets settled, quietly, behind closed doors. But the damage is done, not to Neil's career, to the illusion that artistic freedom comes without cost. Because the truth is, every time Neil Young chooses freedom, he pays for it. In sales, in relationships, in public perception, in the constant accusation that he's sabotaging himself. But here's what the critics never understand. Neil isn't sabotaging his career. He's protecting his soul. Because he watched what happened to Danny Whitten. He felt the weight of that phone call from the coroner. He knows what it costs to prioritize the business over the person. And he made a decision a long time ago. He's not going to let the industry turn him into something he's not, even if refusing costs him everything. The years pass. The albums continue. Some sell, some don't. Some get praised, some get dismissed. Neil Young keeps making music on his own terms, keeps refusing to repeat himself, keeps walking away from success the moment it tries to define him. And all the while, he's fighting that invisible war against the expectations of fans who want more of what they loved, against the pressure of labels who want reliable returns, against the version of Neil Young that exists in everyone's head except his own. That war takes a toll, not publicly. Neil never complains, never explains. He just keeps moving, keeps changing, keeps making the music he needs to make. But privately, the cost adds up. The isolation, the misunderstanding, the constant accusation that he's difficult or unpredictable or unwilling to give people what they want. Because that's the real price of freedom. Not poverty, not obscurity, but being misunderstood by the very people who claim to love your work. Being called self-destructive when you're actually protecting yourself. Being told you're sabotaging your career when you're refusing to let your career sabotage you. Later in life, Neil makes another choice. After 40 years of smoking cannabis and drinking, he stops. Not because of addiction, not because of a crisis, but because, as he says, he did it for 40 years, and now he wants to see what it's like not to. That decision fits the pattern of his entire life. When something becomes routine, when it becomes expected, when it becomes part of the identity everyone projects onto him, he steps away from it. Not dramatically, not with explanation, he just chooses differently. Because freedom means the right to change, the right to evolve, the right to be a human being instead of a fixed image. When you look at Neil Young's career from a distance, it looks chaotic, unpredictable, like a man who can't make up his mind or doesn't know what he wants. But when you look closer, you see the pattern. You see the invisible war. You see a man who's been fighting the same battle for 50 years. The battle to remain himself. The battle against being owned by fame, by the industry, by the expectations of others. And the cost of that battle is steep. Commercially, Neil Young could have been so much bigger. If he'd just repeated Harvest a few times, if he'd given the market what it wanted, if he'd been willing to become the reliable product the industry needed him to be, he'd have more hits, more sales, more universal acclaim, but he'd have lost himself. And Neil Young decided a long time ago that losing himself isn't worth any amount of success. That's the invisible war. Not against a person, not against a label, against the force that tries to turn every artist into a commodity. The force that says your value is in how well you repeat yourself. The force that demands you stay the same, so the market can profit from your predictability. Neil Young fought that force for decades, and he won. Not by becoming more successful than everyone else, but by staying free when everyone else surrendered, by insisting on being a human being instead of a brand, by paying every price the industry demanded and still refusing to give up control of his own identity. Danny Whitten died on November 18, 1972, and Neil Young has been fighting ever since to make sure the music industry doesn't kill him the same way. Not with drugs, but with expectation, with pressure, with the demand that he sacrifice himself to maintain the image. He refused, for 50 years. Through lawsuits and criticism and commercial disappointment and constant misunderstanding, he refused. And that refusal, quiet and unglamorous as it was, matters more than any hit song he ever wrote, because it proved something the industry doesn't want artists to know, that you can say no, that you can choose freedom over approval, that you can fight the invisible war and survive. The cost is high. You'll be called difficult, self-indulgent, past your prime. You'll lose sales and relationships and the comfort of being understood. But you'll keep your soul. You'll keep your freedom. You'll keep being human. And in the end, that's the only thing worth protecting. Not the career, not the image, not the version of yourself that everyone else wants you to be, but the person you actually are, the one nobody else can see or define or own. Neil Young fought an invisible war his entire life, against fame, against grief, against the music industry, against the expectations of millions of people who thought they knew who he was supposed to be. And he won, not by becoming what they wanted, but by refusing to become anything other than himself. That's freedom. That's the cost. And that's the war Neil Young has been fighting since the day Danny Whitten died, and he realized that protecting yourself sometimes means walking away from everything the world is offering. November 18th, 1972. A phone call from a coroner. A decision that haunts. And a war that lasts a lifetime. Neil Young is still fighting, still changing, still refusing to be captured. And that refusal, after all these years, is the most honest music he's ever made.